The guilty must answer for their crimes. It is a policy that defines the concept of law, that for every infraction against such laws that serve to protect the whole, the guilty party should be punished, either in the hope of such punishment acting as a deterrence against future infractions, or simply through some sense of revenge in the mind of the wronged party. The Second World War was rife with crimes, be they regular crimes against the individual or crimes against large groups that don't bear thinking about, such as the scale of the horror that was inflicted. Thus, when the guns fell silent, there was a near universal cry for those guilty of some of the most heinous crimes to answer for them. The question, of course, was just who was guilty and who would answer for these crimes. In Europe, Hitler's Germany had spread such misery that just the word German became a label for a monster. As such, it was very difficult to discern between a German in the SS and a German civilian just trying to live their life. Many argued that Nazism went so deep into German society that there was no difference, or that inaction on the part of an ordinary German citizen to stop the Fuhrer from plundering European wealth and committing mass murder made that citizen just as culpable. As such, in the immediate post-war period, many Germans found themselves being collectively punished for the crimes of the Third Reich. In this episode, we are going to examine the events leading up to and surrounding the tragedy of the Brno Death March, as thousands of ethnic Germans were rounded up in Czechoslovakia and marched to the Austrian border, all the while being subjected to the vilest abuse and mistreatment. Many would not make it in this form of ethnic cleansing, largely forgotten by history, for it concerned those labelled as the enemy. Welcome to Wars of the World. November 1918. Armistice in Europe left millions in the Western nations, such as Britain and France, elated and relieved that the Great War was over. Germany had removed the Kaiser and was willing to accept peace terms that were to be dictated within the Treaty of Versailles, while Germany's ally, the once powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire, was fracturing in almost every corner of the realm it once spanned in Central and Eastern Europe. The new European map that was emerging in the wake of this collapse was almost totally unrecognizable from the one that had existed prior to 1914. New borders were drawn up that not only saw the redistribution of territory between nations, but the creation of completely new ones, such as Czechoslovakia. Casting off the shackles of Viennese rule, a provisional government was established, with statesman Tomáš Masaryk appointed by the Allied powers as president until on November 14, 1918, he was formally elected to the role as Czechoslovakia's first president. However, Masaryk found he was not leading a unified people looking forwards toward their new independent future. Within his post-war borders were a large number of ethnic Germans who still considered themselves German and continued German practices and traditions, as well as speaking the language. Riding the wave of Czechoslovakian nationalism, just over a month after his election, he denounced the German-speaking population and others, such as Austrian and Hungarians, as colonists or settlers rather than true citizens, and he began to clamp down on their influence and power. One example of this can be found in the city of Brno, located in the southeast of the new country, whose 130,000 inhabitants comprised 55,000 German-speaking people, making them the single largest ethnic group, affording them significant influence in the city's politics, cultural identity, and economy. Therefore, to legally weaken the German influence on the city, in 1919, Brno was expanded to include two nearby towns, creating Greater Brno. These towns were predominantly Czechoslovakians, and this caused the population to swell to nearly 250,000, while the German population remained largely unchanged. There was hope that such legal persecution of the Germanic people might force them to relocate to Germany, but many of them had lived their whole lives in the city and were unwilling or unable to do so. The persecution of ethnic Germans led to the creation of both formal and informal civil rights movements, and eventually demands for the largely German-speaking Sudetenland in the western regions along the border with Germany to rejoin the fatherland. This enjoyed support on both sides of the border amongst Germans, but was totally unthinkable to the government in Prague. With Germany constrained by the Treaty of Versailles, the Czechoslovakian government took solace in the fact that militarily they could counter any military ambitions which Berlin might have. But all that changed, of course, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party was elected to power in 1933. Hitler was not content with commanding all Germans in the fatherland, and declared himself the liberator of all ethnic Germans forced to live under the flag of foreign nations after 1918, and this included the Sudetenland. Furthermore, his rearmament program now meant that Czechoslovakia had a genuine military threat on their border. After Anschluss with Austria on March 13, 1938, Hitler now focused on Czechoslovakia, and troops were sent to the border, sparking an international crisis. The Czechoslovakian government under President Edvard Beneš was confident Britain and France would rush to their aid, but quickly they sensed treachery as they found themselves largely cut out of the negotiations. To his horror, Beneš found himself under pressure by allies, enemies and neighbours to agree to Hitler's demands, and the Sudetenland was quickly annexed. In cities like Brno on the east, the German population soon found themselves the target of Czechoslovakian frustration and anger, leading to rioting and assaults. Thus, when Hitler invaded the remainder of Czechoslovakia in May 1939, many of the 52,000 Germans within the city welcomed them in the same fashion as liberators, lining the city streets to give the Nazi salute as they seized government offices and property. The exception were the 12,000 Germans who were of the Jewish faith, who found themselves targets from all angles. German occupation came quickly to Brno, and almost overnight, life for the city's population, regardless of their background, changed beyond recognition. Universities across Czechoslovakia were closed down, and in Brno, that saw the city's Faculty of Law repurposed to a much more nefarious role, as the headquarters for the local Gestapo. This building quickly became feared by the local population, and eventually any Allied prisoners that fell into their hands, usually Allied airmen. Torture and executions were not only commonplace, but highly public affairs, in order to dissuade further resistance to Nazi rule. The academic staff at the university, of which numbered 22,000 in 1939, not only found themselves jobless, but under intense scrutiny as their heritage was examined closely, educated Jews being hunted with a particular lack of mercy. At least 25% of the science staff, for example, found themselves and their families arrested and eventually deported to Austria and the Mauthausen concentration camp before they became victims of the final solution. As the war went on, Brno found itself a major component in the German industrial killing machine at work across Eastern Europe. Between 1941 and 42, over 10,000 Jews were forcibly relocated from the city aboard German Holocaust trains to the Terezínstadt ghetto in the fortress town of Terezín, where they awaited further transport to extermination camps. Conditions at Terezínstadt were deliberately designed to allow disease to spread rampantly amongst the population in order to kill off as many people as possible, just to simply make it easier on the German chain of logistics. 10% of those relocated from Brno in this time period died before ever reaching the extermination camps. Then, in the period after this forced relocation was completed, German officers and Czechoslovakian collaborators and anti-Semites returned to the city in 1943 and proceeded to round up those who were mixed race in the Nazis' twisted ideologies. Anyone who had even the faintest hint of Jewish or Romani gypsy blood. As if suffering under Nazi occupation was not enough, beginning in 1944, the city found itself the subject of several Allied bombing raids, targeting the city's armament and aero engine factories, which of course were repurposed to support the German war efforts, and of course the train station, to disrupt the German transport chain in the east. On November 20th, 1944 alone, 474 US bombers dropped over 2,500 bombs on the city. Weather conditions were poor, and many of the bombs missed their targets, resulting in 578 people being killed, and over 6,000 being made homeless. The sad part for the city's inhabitants was that Brno was not the intended target for that day, the original target being in Poland, with the poor weather forcing them to switch to the Czechoslovakian city. The United States later apologized for the raid, but the city was hit several times more in support of the advancing Soviet army, whose own air force and eventually their artillery began to rain down upon its people. Propaganda leaflets that accompanied the raid made it known that it was the Germans who were the ones responsible for the bombers visiting their city. On March 25, 1945, the Red Army initiated its offensive to capture Brno and the city of Bratislava. This was part of a wider offensive on the Eastern Front that saw Red Army forces make pushes towards securing western Czechoslovakia and onto Vienna in Austria, and was to be carried out by the Soviet Union's Second Ukrainian Front and troops of the Romanian First and Fourth Armies. Romania had been a German ally in the war against the Soviet Union, but with Soviet troops encroaching on Romanian territory in August 1944, they switched sides and declared war on Hitler's Third Reich. Following the fall of Vienna on April 15, 1945, Soviet armor from the 6th Guards Tank Army was redeployed to support the push on Brno. Following a new assault against German lines, a gap was opened that allowed the 6th to storm through, and on April 25th, they reached the eastern outskirts of the city before being joined by the 1st Guards Mechanized Cavalry Group, who entered from the south. By the next day, the city had been declared as liberated, although pockets of German resistance remained for 2 more weeks. The German and collaborationist authorities were quickly ousted and arrested, and their roles replaced by a People's Committee of the city of Brno. By that time, the city had been devastated by the war. According to Brno's own online encyclopedia, out of 26,280 houses, 1,277 of them were completely destroyed, with 1,160 houses being severely damaged enough that they had to be torn down, while an additional 2,775 houses required significant repair work, with 8,504 more sustaining minor damage. Effectively, 1 in every 2 homes in the city had been scarred by the war. With the German army in retreat and no longer a threat, an angry and bitter population began to look for revenge, not just for the damage to their homes, but for the years of fear of persecution, of arrest, of torture, of having treasured family possessions destroyed or stolen during searches, or simply of having family and friends disappear forever. And of course, the city was still rife with the population speaking the language of their former oppressors. Many Germans had left the city by the time that the Red Army was approaching, fearing reprisals at the hands of Soviet troops, who, rather than being punished for their violence towards German civilians, were actually encouraged to do so by their commanding officers. However, a population somewhere in the region of 20,000 remained, as the 6th Guards Tank Army rumbled into the city centre. It's important to note moving forward that the vast majority were women, children and the elderly, as most of the fit and healthy young men had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht to fight for Hitler. Mimicking the way that Jews had been treated under Nazi occupation, the ethnic Germans were forced to wear white armbands to identify themselves, and they immediately faced restrictions on their businesses, while many homes were taken over by Czechoslovakian families, whose own homes were damaged or destroyed. Very quickly, many from the German population were rounded up by the city's new authorities, and it was decided that it would be a fitting punishment for them to be interned at the Kuonik College, where for the previous 6 years, thousands of Czechoslovakians had been interned by the Gestapo. One of their first tasks upon arriving at the college was to begin exhuming the bodies of the Gestapo's victims, buried in the college's grounds. It was backbreaking and traumatizing work, but they received very little sympathy from their guards, who were intent on punishing someone, anyone, for what they had endured. To further emphasize the point that in their captors' eyes they were as guilty as any of Hitler's thugs, some of the German civilians were tasked with building gallows in the college grounds, and between May and June 1945, some 300 Germans were executed for various crimes, the evidence against them often being little more than the word of someone else. At the same time, the prisoners had to hear the cries of angry mobs which had gathered outside, looking to lynch as many of them as possible. The situation was at times on the verge of getting out of control. The question over what to do with local populations of Germans was not confined to Brno, and became the topic of national debate. regardless of their role during the war, or even if they were married to a Czech. Such was the bitterness towards them that expulsion was seen as the only acceptable option to satisfy the cries of the people for some sort of justice. As May drew to a close, 500,000 ethnic Germans were on the move, moving westward towards the now Allied-occupied Austria and Germany. On May 29, 1945, authorities in Brno began formulating a list of those who were to be removed as soon as possible. And the next day, they issued Order No. 78, 1945, which called for the immediate expulsion of the non-working German population from the city. Girls and boys under the age of 14, as well as all women and men over the age of 60, were required to leave the city, with the few working men who were allowed to stay remaining until their roles had been filled by Czechs. As soon as the order had been issued, a mob gathered outside the senior police chief's headquarters and demanded that he carried out the order immediately. Most of the men were workers from the firearms factory, who, as well as being forced to make weapons for their enemy, had suffered comrades being killed and their homes damaged by Allied bombing raids and Soviet artillery, which they blamed on the Germans. In reply, the police chief said he was willing to carry out the instruction, but also expressed concerns that he didn't have enough men to spare to march the Germans south to the Austrian border. The workers from the factory therefore volunteered to help him undertake the task, as did a few former inmates from liberated concentration camps. Armed with clubs, knives, and a few guns, the police chief was in no position to refuse their offer, even if he wanted to. According to the police report, 18,072 Germans were instructed that they were to be escorted to the border and a camp in Austria. But as the people were arranged into columns to begin the forced relocation, the city's authorities were informed that the Austrian post-war government would only accept those who could prove they had Austrian heritage. Despite this, the expulsion had to go ahead. Such was the mood against the city's population that any delay might have resulted in violence. Thus, at around 2200 hours, the first groups were escorted out of the city and into the night. Amongst their number that night was the unusual case of 24-year-old Marie Ransenhoferova. Marie was not a German, being born in Brno to a Czech father and a Hungarian mother. Her father died when she was young, and shortly after that, her mother left for Hungary, leaving her effectively an orphan. Moving around a lot in her formative years, she briefly lived in Germany before the war, learning the language before returning to live on the outskirts of the city prior to Hitler's invasion in 1939. During the war, she gave birth to a son, and it was rumored that the father was an officer in the SS. Just as the march was about to begin, she was approached by a man whom she knew was infatuated with her, but she had rejected his advances. As she recalled later, quote, "One day he came to me and said that I had my son with an SS officer and I had to join the march. But if I went and lived with him, he would turn a blind eye. I told him that he could keep his eyes open and that I'd rather go. So on May 31st at noon, he came to pick me up with a machine gun. I walked in front of him, pushed a cart with my baby, and he followed, until I joined the march that was already moving on the road. He then fired a shot and I cursed him. I said I wished he would drop dead in a ditch, and that's how we parted." End quote. Falling in with thousands of other women, small children, and the elderly, Marie and her son were soon on the road south. It was approximately 31 miles to the border, and the progress was slow and arduous, particularly for mothers like Marie, who had small children with them, who they often had to carry. Many of those on the march had tried to cling on to family heirlooms or other valuables for their new life over the border, but discarded them when they realized they were slowing down their progress, something which always attracted the unwanted attention of their guards. As for the guards themselves, it was clear they were there purely to make sure that they stayed on the road and didn't disappear into the countryside, and they frequently assaulted and robbed the expelled citizens. However, as Marie noted, there was a difference between the two groups who had volunteered to assist the relocation. As she said of them, quote, "These were young men from the Zbrojovka arms factory. They were rude and coarse. But there were also people who came back from Nazi concentration camps, and they were okay. The parts of the march that they supervised were fine. No swearing, no beating. They didn't pull earrings out of women's ears. But the Zbrojovka men, they were really bad, drunk, and armed like bandits. I saw a woman who carried a baby that was crying. One of the guards began yelling at her to make the baby stop. But it didn't, so he took the baby and threw it into the field. I think he killed it. And I also saw this old man. He said he couldn't walk anymore, and he sat down on the side of the road. I came up to him and offered help. I took his hand, but he was dead." End quote. It was obvious that the journey couldn't be undertaken in one go, and so a rest stop was organized in Pohorelice, where the Nazis had previously established a prison camp. For their protection, some of the women and children, including Marie and her son, were given shelter in some barns, being locked inside to prevent them from escaping. The mothers settled down for the night, glad that they could at least rest for a little time and feed their children. Little did they know that their plight was about to get a whole lot worse, as they heard the grumble of 2 truck engines pulling up outside, and the sound of men jumping down from them. These were Romanian soldiers, and they had only one thing in mind, as Marie explained, quote, "They broke in and began raping the women. There was shooting. It was really horrible. Nobody talks about that. It was much worse than the march. There, people were beaten, and they tore their earrings off and took their rings. Some people died. But in the camp, it was like a slaughterhouse." End quote. Either through exhaustion or from the orgy of violence in the night, the guards found by the next morning that many of the expellees were in no condition to walk any further. Therefore, those in the best condition were separated and ordered to continue to the border, while the others were kept in the camp until it could be decided what should be done with them. Marie was strong enough to continue and was glad to leave Pohorelice, particularly after seeing bodies being loaded into trucks to be buried in mass graves, victims of the abuse. Marie, her son, and around 10,000 others continued to the border town of Mykolaiv, but there was still the question of whether she and others like her would be allowed into Austria, with the Austrian and Czechoslovakian governments still negotiating over the matter. Meanwhile, the ever-defiant Marie felt enough was enough, and at a crossroads just outside Mykolaiv, she and her son made a run for it when she sensed an opportunity. Her escape encouraged many others to do the same, and amidst the chaos, she succeeded in giving her guards the slip. She made her way to Mykolaiv and was able to find help, eventually deciding to settle in the town. Those that did manage to enter Austria did so with very little in the way of money or belongings, and they had to rely on the charity of the Austrian people. But for those still at Pohorelice, their suffering was far from over. With the Austrian government having convinced the Czechoslovak government to halt the relocation, the camp was left bursting with the expelled Germans, and in the first few weeks there was little in the way of administration to feed them and attend to their medical needs. Disease ran rampant, and with poor sanitation, dysentery quickly began claiming many lives. As June went on, the Czechoslovak authorities realized they had to take control of the situation, and so they began to improve conditions, such as a regular flow of supplies into the camp, and the establishment of a hospital. But by then, the damage had already been done. Arguments still raged between historians as to just how many died on the march and in the camp, from either violence or disease, but most figures put it in the region of just under 2,000 people. Pohorelice continued functioning until July 7th, 1945. By then, many of those held there had either been relocated to Austria and on to Germany, or had been housed in the surrounding countryside until they could be processed. Around 2,000 people were selected to return to Brno, but when the news of this reached the city, there was an explosion in violent protests. The last 80 Germans in the camp were almost all severely ill and were being cared for in the hospital before they were transferred out. As Czechoslovakia became consumed within the communist sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, the post-war expulsion of non-Czechoslovakians was quietly forgotten. However, following the return of democracy and the partition of the country in 1992 into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, history has come to accept this darker chapter concerning the treatment of a vanquished foe, and serves as a reminder that while Allied nations fought against tyranny and oppression, anyone when consumed by enough hatred can be capable of the most horrendous of acts, and not just those with a swastika on their arm.